So folks, my name is Kevin Grode. I'm the Reservoir Regulation Team Lead for the Missouri Basin Water Management Office for the Corps of Engineers. There are a lot of you standing, and if you want to stand, that's fine, but there are seats available. So if you have a seat next to you that's available for someone to sit in, can you please just raise your hand? So grab a seat if you wish. If you want to stand, that's fine. I'm just going to give you fair warning. We were in Bismarck last night, and we were there for 2.5 hours. So I can't stand for 2.5 hours, but if you can, great. We recognize that many of you were severely impacted by this flooding event. We thank you for coming to this. We will be here after this presentation to let every single one of you have a chance to express what you came here to say. But I know you don't want to sit through a long presentation. That's not why you came to this meeting. But we were in Bismarck last night. We were in Fort Peck the other day. We give this presentation for those of you who haven't been to some of our semi-annual presentations, because it really does explain what the Missouri River Mainstem system is and how it works and how we go through our decision-making process. And so if you could just bear with myself and Mike as we give this presentation, it just might give a little bit more information when we get into the question and answer period, because we found last night at Bismarck that we were constantly going back to slides to kind of give a little bit more context to what our answers were in regards to some of the questions that were asked. So I just ask for your patience through this. So the Missouri River Mainstem system, which is comprised of 6 reservoirs on the Missouri River Mainstem. And sometimes we do call it the system because it's really operated as a system of reservoirs rather than 6 individual projects. So we have Fort Peck, Garrison, Owyhee, Big Bend, Fort Randall, and Gavins Point. And all of them are on the Missouri River, 2,321 miles, which makes it the longest river in the United States, longer than the Mississippi River, for those of you who know people on the Mississippi River. And this is the mission of our office. We are to regulate those 6 projects, the system, for 8 congressionally authorized purposes: flood control, navigation, hydropower, water supply, fish and wildlife, which includes the threatened and endangered species, irrigation, water quality control, and recreation. This series of graphs is to represent the amount of drainage area that is controlled by each one of the Mainstem projects. So this area in purple is what drains into Fort Peck, about 57,000 square miles. Between Fort Peck and Garrison, we have another 123,000 square miles. Between Garrison and Owyhee, another 60,000 square miles. And then we have Big Bend and Fort Randall, and then finally Gavins Point. All told, the Mainstem system controls about 280,000 square miles of the 530,000 square miles in the overall Missouri River Basin. These little gray triangles are also tributary projects, some owned by the Corps of Engineers, some owned by the Bureau of Reclamation. And then outside of that purple area, these blue areas are tributary projects which are operated by the Omaha District, Corps of Engineers projects. And then the Kansas City District, we have these tributary projects here. The areas you see here are all unregulated areas, meaning that there's no dams in those areas to capture any of the runoff. All the water that comes into those rivers, just as Kevin mentioned during his presentation, find their way to the Missouri River. This graphic depicts the size of the Mainstem projects. Now, I talked about Fort Peck, Garrison, and Oahe. They're the upper three, and sometimes they're called the big three because they contain the vast majority of the storage of the system. When you look at Big Bend and Gavins Point, very small projects. In fact, if you look for this color right here, this white, or maybe it's a gray, and this red, that's the flood control storage. And you can see that there's 4 projects that have flood control storage. When it comes to Big Bend and Gavins Point, very, very small amounts of flood control storage. These projects are re-regulation projects. What comes in pretty much goes out. They do a lot when it comes to recreation, to hydropower generation, to water supply, but when it comes to flood control, they're not much of a player. It's really these 4 that make a difference. When we get into a drought, it's these 3 that make the difference. We draw these reservoirs down into the carryover multiple use zone to get us through long extended droughts. When it comes to droughts, these 3 down here, they're really not impacted. So I use the word system. So what I mean by that is that we make some of our decisions based on how much water is in all 6 projects. So this graphic is if you were to take all 6 of them and put them together into one project, this is what it would look like. So we have 4 zones. We have the permanent pool zone, which is the minimum amount of water we need in each one of the reservoirs to operate for things like hydropower. We have this carryover multiple use zone, the largest zone. And this zone is to get us through long extended droughts. The last one was from 2000 to 2007. And at that point, we reached our historic minimum. This zone up here, I'm going to skip the zone and go to here first. This zone, this top zone, is the exclusive flood control zone. And just as the name implies, when we're in that zone, we are regulating exclusively for flood control. This annual flood control and multiple use zone, that's where we want to be, 365 days out of the year. Ideally, we start the runoff season, which is on or about March 1st, right here at the base of the annual flood control and multiple use zone. As we see the snow melt come off and the rainfall happening in March and April, we rise into this zone. And then we continue rising into it in May, June, and July when we see the mountain snowpack and rainfall occurring. And then during the drier months, August, September, October, November, December, January, we meter that water out to meet all those authorized purposes. This is where we can best meet all 8 authorized purposes. This is where we're at right now. We have about 50% of the total flood control storage available for us. So we take those same 4 zones, they're applied to all of the projects. And here we can see Fort Peck and Garrison. They have some water stored in their annual flood control multiple use zone. But we've saved a lot of that storage because when it comes to mountain snowmelt, these are the 2 projects that receive that mountain snowpack. Oahe and Fort Randall, they're further into that annual flood control multiple use zone. In fact, Fort Randall is in the exclusive flood control. And these rose very quickly over the last couple of weeks because all that snow melted in mid-April, in mid-March. So I'm going to talk about the runoff components. What makes the runoff? And there's really 3 major components. So we have plain snowpack, and that usually melts off in February, March, and April. And during March and April, the 2 months of March and April, when we're seeing the plain snow melting off and the rainfall occurring, we'll normally get about 25% of the annual runoff into the system. The mountain snowpack melts off in May, June, and July, and of course we get precipitation during those 3 months. During those 3 months, we normally get about 50% of the runoff into the basin. So in this 5-month period, March, April, May, June, and July, we normally see about 75% of the total runoff. During the other 7 months is where we see the other 25%. We update a forecast at least every month, more often if conditions change significantly. Our April 1 forecast is 38.2 million acre feet. Just to give you a point of reference, the runoff in 2018 was 42. This is 150% of average. Our normal upper basin runoff, and when I say upper basin, it's above Sioux City, Iowa, is about 25.3 million acre feet. So last year, 2018, was the third highest upper basin runoff in 120 years. If this 38.2 is actually realized, it will be the sixth highest in 121 years. So I'm going to step through each one of those runoff components real quick. So this is what we thought was the maximum amount. When we looked at the basin as a whole, it was our estimation that on March 10th, that was the maximum amount of snowpack we had in the upper basin. And I circled this point here. If you look at the graph here, and Kevin even mentioned it during that, when we talk about inches of water equivalent, it's not snow depth we're talking about. It's the amount of liquid content in the snow. So just like you did in science class when you're in 4th or 5th grade, you take a bucket of snow, you put it into your garage, and you let it melt. That is what we're talking about of snow water equivalent. And you can see from this graph, when you look at this 4 to 5, 5 to 6, and 6 to 8, you can see those colors in this area here. This is be going into a Oahe Reservoir, but then a lot of this right here. You remember that one slide I was talking about where there's no color, there's no purple, there's no blue? This is that unregulated area. It's the James River, the Big Sioux River, the Vermilion River. And those all flow into the Missouri River downstream of Gavins Point. Very, very heavy snow up in those areas. And even in parts of Montana and then down into parts of Nebraska and Iowa, you can see that we had 1 to 2, 2 to 3, in some cases 3 to 4 inches of snow water equivalent in that plain snow. And of course, I will caveat this also, we thought it all had melted, but now it appears there's more snow to melt over the next few days. So the second component is mountain snowpack. Now last year we were about 140% of average. We had very heavy snow up in the mountains in 2018. In 2019, we're below average in both of those regions. So this will be melting off and running into Fort Peck. This will be melting off and running into Garrison. And then precipitation. So if you look at the legend here again, when you see the blues and purples, that's above average, much above average. And you get into the yellows and the reds, that's below average. Well, what we're seeing over the last 3 months are a lot of blues and purples. Over the last 3 months in the Missouri River Basin, it has been much wetter than normal. In some places, extremely wet, 3 to 4 times more than normal. When we go over the last 30 days, you can see there are parts of the upper basin where it has been fairly dry. But then again, Kevin mentioned that storm that came through that really made a difference here. So in some of these areas, 3 to 4, and even up to 6 times normal. And then the precipitation outlooks, and he mentioned them, so I'm just going to touch on them a little bit. We do use these in our runoff forecast. It's really important to note that the equal chances, when you see this area that doesn't have a color on it, that doesn't mean it's not going to rain. What that equal chances means is that there's an equal chance of below normal precipitation, normal precipitation, and above normal precipitation. In other words, they really don't know what's going to happen in these areas. In the areas that are colored in green means that they have a higher likelihood of it being above normal precipitation, and in the brown, a higher likelihood of below normal precipitation. Did I characterize that correctly, Kevin Lau? Thank you. I'm not a meteorologist, so sometimes I misinterpret what their products are. When we look out into July, August, and September, you can see a lot of that green in the lower basin. And just over the next 3 months, you can see a lot of green. So I would echo what Kevin says, that it could be very active these next few months. And then the soil conditions. Now I know everyone has, right now, they have too much water in their minds. But our basin has gone through droughts. It will go through another drought. I don't know when, but it will go through a drought. And you can see that right now, the basin, for the most part, there's only a little bit of Wyoming that's really being, showing any signs of below drier soils. In fact, when you look at the soil moisture content, this green is as dark as it can be on this scale. So we have areas of Nebraska, almost the entire state of Iowa, and South Dakota, southeastern South Dakota, that are extremely wet. And why that is important, and you all know this, if you have a garden, if you have a field, if you have extremely wet soils, most of the rain that falls is going to become runoff. It's not going to soak into the ground. And so then that just means the runoff running into the rivers is going to be more. So this graph is, and I talked about third highest of 120 years, sixth highest of 121 years. This is really what shows that. This is all the way back to 1898. This is the annual runoff above Sioux City. So this was, right here in 2018, third highest. 1997 and 2011 were the only ones higher. This is where we're at right now in 2019. That's what we're forecasting, 38.2. Sixth highest out of 120 years. And you can see we've really had some wet years. But we have had periods where it has been below average for multiple years. This was the 1930 to 1941 drought during the Great Depression. We've had 4 of those periods in our basin, the last one ending in 2007. So this graph depicts, this is how 2019 is stacking up month by month. The blue is what has happened. The yellow is what we're forecasting. The red is the long-term average, 121 years of record. So you can see in January and February, we were about average. But March was significant. 11 million acre feet. Clearly, the record highest March Upper Basin has ever seen. 4 times average. In April, we're expecting almost 2 times the average of runoff, and that really is just a reflection of the plain snow that has melted but just hasn't found its way to the reservoirs yet. And as I mentioned, that really wet soil out there, so any precipitation that falls, we think that is going to produce a lot of runoff. So we're expecting another very high runoff month in April. And May and June and July, as you recall, I said that's when the mountain snowpack melts. But the mountain snowpack right now is below average. But again, because of the precipitation outlooks calling for above average precipitation and the very wet soils that we have, we're actually expecting the runoff in May, June, and July to be above average. As we get out to August, September, October, there's less runoff during those drier months, and there's less reliability when it comes to the precipitation outlook. So we're pretty much calling for average during those months. But last year, we were very much above average during August, September, and October because, as you recall, it was a very wet summer and fall. Will that occur this year? It might. So let's talk about that March runoff, that 11 million acre feet I talked about, 4 times average. Not that we're here to break records, but we did. We broke a lot of records. It was the largest March runoff since record keeping began in 1898. The previous record was 7.3 million acre feet in 1952. For those of you that are old enough to remember 1952, that was a significant flood on the Missouri River, and a lot of changes were made based on that flood and what occurred during that flood. Again, 4 times the monthly average for March. When we look at reaches between Oahe and Fort Randall, that was the record highest volume that reach received. And it's more than that reach receives in a normal year that they received in March. It was the record highest volume in the reach between Fort Randall and Gavins Point, so this would be the Niobrara River. And it's more than double the previous record. And then between Gavins Point and Sioux City, which would be the James River, the Big Sioux River, the Vermilion River, that one again was the highest volume in that reach, and it was more than, again, just like this reach here. In March, we received more than we would normally receive in an entire year in that reach. So my last slide is to talk about the Gavins Point operations during the March event. Now, I want to point out that we closed the gates at Fort Randall on March 13th. So there was no water flowing into the Gavins Point Reservoir as of March 13th. We recognized how much water was coming down the Niobrara River. And so we wanted to lessen the amount of water coming into Gavins Point to the extent we could. And that is the only control point we have upstream of Gavins Point Reservoir. And we closed Fort Randall, I believe, over a 10-day period for at least 8 of those days. But even with that, the inflow into Gavins Point was significant. Most of this came from the Niobrara River. Then there are other streams that come into that area also. But as Kevin mentioned, it was 2 to 4 inches of rain, which is not significant. We've all seen 2 to 4 inches of rain, on top of 2 to 4 inches of snowpack, and again, we've probably all seen that too, on top of deeply frozen ground. The combination of those three led to just tremendous amounts of water coming down the Niobrara River. As I'm sure you've all seen, the Spencer Dam, which is not a Corps of Engineers project, was blown out, was destroyed by the amount of water coming down the Niobrara River. As we saw all this inflow coming down the Niobrara River, and as we saw the Gavins Point pool quickly filling above the base of the exclusive flood control zone and above the top of the exclusive flood control zone, we had to make some quick decisions. Now let's just review what we have here now. So the base of the annual flood control, I kind of talked about that in one of the first slides. We were down here. Total flood control storage from here to here is 133,000 acre feet, which sounds like a lot. 133 is a lot. But it's not when you compare it to 16.3 million. This amount of storage is less than 1% of the storage of the entire 6 projects. The project was not built to be a big storage project. It was built and designed and it is operated as a re-regulation project. What does that mean? What does it mean to be a re-regulation project? And really, the point of it is to smooth out the flows from Fort Randall. Fort Randall is a hydro-peaking power plant. What that means is it releases more water and generates more power when that power is most needed. So during the high usage parts of the day, they release more releases. During the lower use portions of the day, they reduce those releases. So you see this sort of wave effect coming out from Fort Randall. Gavins Point takes that water, takes that wave, and through its releases, smooths it out so that it can be used downstream, primarily for navigation and water supply, but it also produces hydropower. So as we saw this go into the base of exclusive flood control and realizing it was going to go into the top of the exclusive flood control zone. And again, what do we mean by top of exclusive flood control? There are 14 spillway gates at Gavins Point. When those spillway gates are closed, we're at elevation 1210. anything above 1210, without operating those gates, the water spills over the gates. The gates are not designed to have water spilling over top of them. So what we had to do, and what Tom and his crew had to do, was to raise all of those gates. And when you raise those gates and the water exceeds the top elevation of 1210, you're actually creating more storage in the reservoir. So by doing that, we went from 133 to over 200,000 acre feet. We created about 70,000 more acre feet by doing that. So we peaked at 12.3. We surcharged all 14 gates, which we had never done before at Gavins Point. We have done it at Fort Peck, and we have done it at Garrison. It's not an operation that we do, that we like to do at all, and we do it with great apprehension because we increase the risk of those gates not being able to be closed because they're really not designed to be operated in that manner. But we understood what the situation was, and our efforts were to minimize the amount of water we had to release out of Gavins Point. But even with that additional storage, we were forced to increase releases up to 100,000 CFS for a 6-hour period because we saw that even with raising the gates, that the pool continued to rise. As we finally saw the pool peak and work its way down, we were then able to step down the releases. You can see we're always a little bit more than the inflow because we needed to get that pool level out of surcharge zone, and we needed to get it out of exclusive flood control zone, and then that's where you're seeing right here. All right, so with that, I will turn it over to Mike.